Wonderful. Okay, so as Dr. Temkin mentioned, I'm BJ Reimel. I work here in beautiful sunny Los Angeles. So thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk today. Oh, they're not advancing. Let's try this. There we go. Okay, so these are my disclosures. None of them are relevant today. I'm going to start with a brief history of cervical cancer. So it turns out that Georgios Papanikolaou and Ariel Bebes, who or Dr. Bebes may actually have gotten there first, determined that cancer could be detected by inspecting cervical cells. Papanikolaou then, under the supervision of Dr. Charles Stockard, presented his findings at the Third Race Betterment Conference. That was the first presentation of Pap testing as an option for cervical cancer screening. Take all the time you need with that information. This first screening test to become widely used for cancer, the Pap test, was named obviously for Dr. Papanikolaou, and its invention spurred many further and important things for women's health. But I'd like to pause for a moment to recognize the work of Dr. Papanikolaou's wife and collaborator, Mrs. Andromache Papanikolaou, who worked with her husband in his laboratory. Oh, my slides are not working. For over 20 years and underwent daily Pap testing in his laboratory. So moving on, the Pap test really picked up after 1943, after the publishment of the paper, but also the book by Papanikolaou and Trout on the topic detailing in the test and how to use it. And so at that time, cytology specialists and pathologists and gynecologists began to work for the implementation, and screening programs popped up all across the United States, in the US, and elsewhere in the world. And in 1976, Harold Zerhausen postulated that HPV was the cause of cervical cancer, driving forward the concept that it was a viral oncology that would truly change the face of screening. And then by 1995, HPV 16 and 18 had been sequenced and was determined to be absolutely pathogenic, with links towards carcinogenesis tighter than smoking and lung cancer. The introduction of liquid-based cytology demonstrated that an efficient alternative to the previous glass slide-based test was available and now allowed for direct screening of the sample for the presence of HPV. Gardasil was the first HPV vaccine covering HPV 16 and 18 and was released in 2006. Cervical cancer incidence was then reduced by screening and interventions for precancers by 45%. Despite the dramatic improvement in case rate, the death rate from cervical cancer did not decline proportionally, and 5-year relative survival has remained steady. So how can this be? The best cancer screening tool ever developed and no change in mortality? Early stage disease accounts for the majority of patients and has an excellent 5-year survival, but even regional spread of disease has a vast reduction in cure. Distant disease is nearly a death sentence. So who gets cervical cancer? It turns out that more Black and Hispanic and Native women other than white or Asian women get cervical cancer based on data from the SEER data set. Well, who dies from cervical cancer? Unfortunately, more Black and Hispanic and American Indian, First Nations, Indigenous women die from cervical cancer. Treatment for disease tends to remain palliative for distant disease. And this table lists the results of the NCI-funded trials to advance cervical cancer from 1985 to 2014, with improvements in overall survival of only 10 months in nearly 30 years of large-scale randomized studies. Novel agents, including immunotherapy, suggest there's hope for our cervical cancer mortality. These studies are a few of the big trials this year in cervical cancer, all of them funded by pharmaceutical companies. It should perhaps be noted that these are not NCI funded. They highlight the increasing advancement, but also the impending danger. We're going from a 2-drug combination in 2000 given 6 times to 3 drugs given in 2014 given indefinitely. And now in 2021, we'll be moving towards a 4-drug regimen with immunotherapy, going for a full 24 months for those who have a complete response. Cost and equity issues are looming larger as these therapies provide life prolongment, but more quality of life and financial toxicity. How can we address both equity and therapy? And why have we not done so already? Where are these patients with cervical cancer? Who are they? Are we really conducting our studies to ensure equity? GOG 240 supplemental data, got to dig into this stuff, shows that only 13% of the study population was Black. But we would have expected that a larger population of Black women would have higher representation based on the data we've already seen about the incidence in the population. We have to ask ourselves why. What are the opportunities to do better? What is our traditional clinical trial design doing to us? And what is the reality of participation? I'd like to suggest some opportunities. We can treat this like a rare disease. We can address the structural racism that holds us hostage. We can acknowledge that cervical cancer is affecting our low socioeconomic status patients and create opportunities for them. And I will invite you to consider that location matters and that solutions to urban and rural situations will be different. First, feasibility. It's defined as the state or degree of being easily or conveniently done. It's a concept that's workable or practical or viable. This for me goes into 2 buckets, both structural and trial specific. Structurally, I think about where are the humans with cancer? Where do they get their care? Do these centers open cervical cancer trials? If not, why not? Is it because of the cost? Is it lack of enrollment? Is it insurance coverage, language, distrust of the system? Are there trial-specific problems in our cervical cancer trials? Are there inclusion criteria representative of a population that exists in sufficient quantity to study? Is there testing required for screening that requires time or multiple visits? And is there a role for a smaller or broader study? Cervical cancer is a rare disease. There are more cases of myeloma, which is included in the National Organization of Rare Disorders, but cervical cancer is not listed, despite the same math. I would invite us to consider rare disease magnets. Registries with large national well-annotated data sets may help us find these patients. Support groups, both local and national, which can be conducted, we know now, both in person and virtual. Strategies utilizing electronic medical record data to screen populations in real time, and data sharing. Next, I'd like to discuss how we can address structural racism, or can at least consider its addressing, as this is an incredible important thing. I would turn to the words of the Baltimore Racial Justice Action group, because I can't say it as well, but basically the statement is as such: diversity is silent on the subject of equity. In an anti-oppression context, therefore, the issue is not diversity, but rather equity. And often when people talk about diversity, they're thinking only of the non-dominant groups. We'd like to shift our view from a system that is a race with one starting line to a race that takes into account the shape and scope of the track. This is data from the US Cancer Statistics Working Group that shows the rate of new cervical cancers to cluster around the southern states and follows the Appalachian Mountain Range. These maps show some striking resemblance between the new cervical cancers and the proportion of Black or African American people listed in the 2016 census. This overlap is also seen with the Hispanic population, especially in the southern states. Geographically, cervical cancer incidence has not changed much since 1995 to 2004, but it should be noted that this data demonstrates the incredible differences in cervical cancer rates between racial minority populations. This map shows the prevalence of people in poverty by state as measured by in 2015. And this distribution should start to look startlingly familiar as I return back to the incidence of cervical cancer. I don't need to tell you, especially after the excellent talks today, that being poor makes it really hard for a person to participate in clinical trials. Clinical trial design needs to account for the participants' tangible needs, transportation needs, work needs. For example, if a patient has a weekend job or a weekday job but can't come in for their treatments, the inability to perform any research on the weekends because the research staff doesn't have time then really inhibits the ability for patients who are interested in participating to work. Another barrier in our clinical trials that we can improve is low English fluency. In my hospital, it's not uncommon for me to have 8 to 10 different languages interpreted here in Los Angeles, but low English fluency is essential it's a barrier for clinical trial enrollment, and in-person translation can be essential for consent. Hospital-based translation services are strongly preferred, and clinical trial budgets must reflect this requirement. Patient-reported outcomes need to be in the patient's preferred language, and this includes online content, which is often forgotten as trials shift to be more online. This map shows the distribution of the new cervical cancer cases, but also shows the capturing of the language other than English spoken at home in persons of age 5 years or more. And the distribution also shows some similarities with. And finally, to my last point, I think that location matters. Incidence of cervical cancer is different in different states, and we've seen it bear a strong relationship to racial disparity, economic disparity, and perhaps even English fluency. But I often hear, but didn't the internet dissolve all of our location barriers? Can't we just reach patients through social media, video visits, and telehealth? Aren't we all online in the same universe? Perhaps, but perhaps not. This is a map showing households with broadband internet subscription between 2015 and 2019. And you can definitely see a striking paucity of access to internet services in the same distribution as new cervical cancer cases. And urban areas with higher free Wi-Fi access and more cell phone towers have better options for the kinds of strategies we've discussed. In fact, there's probably a sizable group that could be part of more studies if they had less in-person visits. But rural areas with patients without working internet may benefit from provided devices and internet access as part of their options for care. Burner phones could be used for research and not just action heroes. In final thoughts, I'd like to reimagine cervical cancer, a disease of patients who are historically underrepresented due to race, language, property, and location. I'd like to imagine a world where we recognize that cervical cancer is a rare disease and enact strategies to bring patients into the centers. And third, I'd like to consider clinical trial strategies and designs that would improve equity by allowing smaller enrollment numbers per site, promote the inclusion of non-English fluent patients to participate in all aspects of the clinical trial, including patient-reported outcomes, and consider compensating patients for their travel or provide them with technology to allow for off-site monitoring. Finally, I'd like to thank some important people and organizations. First, the NIH, the United States of America, where hard questions can be asked and answered. Dr. Sarah Temkin, who has been an incredible mentor and guide for me in this journey in GYN oncology. I'd like to thank Dr. Clayton for her advocacy and passion for women's health, and to Dr. Vivian Pinn for starting it all. Thank you.